Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on fiscal capacity, the Federal Reserve, and public cost. The core question is this: how have tax revenue and Federal Reserve policy changed what government can promise, fund, and protect? The core competency is to summarize changes to American tax and revenue policy since the creation of the Federal Reserve. How much public power can a government raise, borrow, and allocate before fiscal capacity becomes a permanent argument over who pays and who gets protected? The struggle moves through taxes, borrowing, central banking, inflation control, congressional budgeting, and the permanent dispute over who finances public protection. Government sounds noble until the bill arrives. A republic can promise national defense, courts, highways, food inspection, disaster relief, Social Security, Medicare, farm supports, federal education loans, veterans benefits, border enforcement, research grants, prisons, airports, and public health capacity. Each promise needs money, staff, rules, offices, audits, payment systems, and political defense. Tax and revenue policy is where public values stop floating and start demanding arithmetic. The civic problem is that Americans often want mutually incompatible fiscal outcomes. They want a strong military, secure retirement, good roads, disaster response, low taxes, low inflation, cheap credit, low debt, and economic growth. Those goals can support one another in some moments, but they also collide. Cutting taxes may please voters and reduce revenue. Raising taxes may fund programs, but create political backlash. Borrowing may stabilize a crisis, but add debt service. Raising interest rates may cool inflation, but raise mortgage, credit card business, and government borrowing costs. Fiscal policy means government taxing and spending decisions. Monetary policy means Federal Reserve decisions that shape money supply, credit conditions, and interest rates. Congress and presidents control the fiscal side through taxes, appropriations, deficits, and debt. The Federal Reserve controls key parts of monetary policy through a central bank structure that sits at a deliberate distance from direct electoral pressure. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 serves as the source anchor because banking panic showed that the United States had a financial machine with weak stabilizers. In the same year, the 16th Amendment gave the national government a firmer income tax foundation. Those two changes belong together. The modern federal government needs revenue capacity and monetary management. Without revenue, policy becomes theater. Without monetary stability, prices, credit, jobs, and savings become political dynamite. After Andrew Jackson let the Second Bank of the United States expire in 1836, the nation lived without a durable central bank. State banks, the independent treasury, and then the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a more uniform currency and a national banknote system, but they did not solve the core instability. Reserve requirements pyramided cash into major city banks, currency supply tightened during crop moving season, and local institutions still depended on fragile confidence. When depositors rushed for cash, the system had no standing national lender of last resort ready to flood the market with liquidity. That weakness showed itself in repeated panics. The crashes of 1873 and 1893 exposed how railroad speculation, gold pressures, and weak bank reserves could turn financial strain into unemployment and business collapse. The Panic of 1907 made the structural problem unmistakable. Runs spread after the Knickerbocker Trust Company failed, call money markets seized, the stock exchange faced a liquidity crunch, and J.P. Morgan gathered private bankers in his library to coordinate emergency support. A republic that claimed continental economic power was still depending on a private financier to improvise the rescue. Congress answered first with the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908. That law allowed emergency currency under strain and created the National Monetary Commission to study European central banks and propose a more durable American design. Senator Nelson Aldrich returned with a plan for a reserve association. Progressive Democrats and agrarian critics rejected any system that looked like Wall Street monopoly. Woodrow Wilson, Representative Carter Glass, and Senator Robert Owen pushed a different compromise in 1913. 12 regional reserve banks, a governing board in Washington, rediscount authority, and federal supervision strong enough to stabilize banking without admitting a single private money center could rule the whole system. The revenue side of the story moved on a parallel track. Tariffs and excise taxes had financed much of the 19th century federal state, but they were too narrow and too volatile for a modern administrative republic that wanted war capacity, infrastructure, regulation, and later social insurance. Ratification of the 16th Amendment in February 1913 let Congress tax incomes without apportionment by state population. That constitutional change gave the federal government a flexible revenue instrument just months before the Federal Reserve Act supplied a more elastic credit and currency structure. The constitutional tension sits in the split between fiscal and monetary authority. Congress and the president tax, borrow, and spend through elections, committees, appropriations, and public bargaining. The Federal Reserve adjusts discount rates, reserve conditions, open market operations, and emergency lending through an expert institution designed to move faster than ordinary legislation. That arrangement can stabilize credit and prices, but it also guarantees recurring blame fights when elected officials and central bankers try to shift responsibility for inflation, recession, debt, or unemployment. Fiscal capacity also depends on timing. Congress can authorize taxes or borrowing, Treasury can manage debt issuance, and the Federal Reserve can influence credit conditions, but households experience those decisions through prices, interest rates, wages, and public services. A budget table becomes a rent payment, a payroll deduction, a mortgage rate, or a delayed project once public finance reaches ordinary life. Congress writes tax laws under pressure from voters, donors, parties, committees, industries, state interests, and budget math. The House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee carry force because tax language does not write itself. A bracket, deduction, credit, phase-out exemption, or enforcement rule can shift billions of dollars. Tax policy rewards people who read details. A child tax credit, mortgage interest deduction, capital gains rate, payroll tax cap, corporate depreciation rule, or earned income tax credit carries a distributional judgment. Someone benefits, someone pays, someone claims growth, someone claims fairness. Before Congress votes, budget scoring turns that language into estimated revenue effects. A 10-year score can make a proposal look affordable, expensive, or politically impossible. Lawmakers therefore time expiration dates, phase-ins, and phase-outs to manage the score. That is not trivia. It is how a tax promise becomes a budget number. Presidents propose budgets and tax plans, but Congress holds the constitutional purse. The Office of Management and Budget coordinates executive proposals. The Congressional Budget Office estimates costs. Appropriations committees decide discretionary spending. Authorizing committees create or revise programs. Budget resolutions, reconciliation instructions, continuing resolutions, debt limit fights, and omnibus bills turn fiscal policy into procedure. A citizen who says Congress should cut waste should ask which account, which statute, which constituency, and which implementation chain. Deficits emerge when spending exceeds revenue in a fiscal period. National debt accumulates from repeated borrowing. Debt can fund legitimate public needs. Wars, recessions, pandemics, infrastructure investments, and tax cuts have all produced borrowing. The issue is not whether debt is always immoral. The issue is whether borrowing serves a public purpose, whether the economy can carry the interest cost, and whether current voters shift burdens onto future taxpayers without admitting it. Debt service turns yesterday's choices into today's budget constraint. When interest costs rise, Congress has less room for other priorities unless it raises taxes, cuts programs, or borrows more. A campaign promise may sound free at a rally. In the Treasury market, it becomes borrowing, interest, maturity schedules, investor confidence, and budget scoring. Treasury officials must issue bills, notes, and bonds on schedules that investors trust. If borrowing costs climb, the fiscal room for new law shrinks before a single committee hearing begins. The Federal Reserve faces a different pressure. If inflation rises, households feel it at grocery stores, rent payments, tuition bills, medical costs, and gas stations. Inflation reduces purchasing power, punishes cash savings, and can make workers feel poorer even when wages rise. The Fed may raise interest rates to cool demand. That can slow price increases, but it can also make mortgages more expensive, reduce business investment, increase unemployment risk, and raise federal borrowing costs. The Fed does not get a painless lever. If the Fed keeps rates low, credit may expand and hiring may improve, but asset prices may inflate and savers may lose return. If the Fed moves late, inflation may harden. If it moves too aggressively, recession may follow. This is why monetary policy demands judgment under uncertainty. The Fed uses data, models, regional reports, employment numbers, inflation measures, and financial market signals. Those tools improve judgment, they do not remove risk. Ordinary citizens sit at the receiving end, a borrower carrying federal education debt, homeowner, renter, small business owner, retiree, farmer, hospital administrator, city budget officer, and factory worker experience fiscal and monetary policy differently. Higher interest rates may reward savers and punish borrowers. Tax credits may help families who know how to claim them and miss families who lack stable filing records. Inflation may help some debtors repay with cheaper dollars while punishing fixed-income retirees. Public finance is not one national feeling, it is a distribution system. The Federal Reserve Act moved through Congress in December 1913 as a compromise document written under distrust. Carter Glass and Robert Owen had to reassure Southerners and Westerners that New York bankers would not own the system, while bankers demanded enough central capacity to stop the next panic. The statutory language shows the bargain. Congress created reserve banks to furnish an elastic currency, to afford means of rediscounting commercial paper, and to establish a more effective supervision of banking. Those phrases were not decorative. Elastic currency meant the money supply had to expand in panic rather than snap. Rediscounting meant member banks could turn short-term paper into liquidity instead of collapsing in a run. The architecture carried the politics in its wiring. 12 regional reserve banks checked the fear of one money capital, while the Federal Reserve Board in Washington created a national supervisory center. That design admitted what the 19th century had tried to avoid, saying plainly a continental economy needed permanent financial administration. Congress still wrote the statute and could amend it, but once the act existed, expertise gained a protected operating zone inside the constitutional order. The 16th Amendment sharpened the same pressure from the revenue side. An income tax is not a moral mood. It is withholding tables, brackets, audits, penalties, returns, treasury collection, and a permanent federal claim on recorded earnings. That claim can fund war mobilization, highways, veterans benefits, Social Security, disaster aid, and regulatory capacity. It can also trigger resistance because every expansion of state capacity carries a paper trail and an enforcement arm. Budget deficits expose the joint tension between the two systems. Congress can promise benefits and postpone visible pain through borrowing. The Federal Reserve can stabilize markets, buy securities in crisis, or tighten money when inflation surges. Neither tool abolishes the underlying trade-off. Every public good requires capacity, every capacity requires funding, every funding source distributes burden, and every burden creates politics. The unresolved question is whether a free people want officials who name that trade-off honestly or institutions skilled at hiding it until the invoice arrives. Fiscal and monetary policy are governing machinery, not slogans. Tax cuts, spending programs, interest rates, deficits, and debt all sound abstract until they hit paychecks, credit cards, rent, groceries, business loans, hospital budgets, city bonds, and retirement accounts. Economic policy is constitutional design with a price tag. The sharpest audit follows one decision all the way through the machine. An interest rate increase changes mortgage pricing, business borrowing, hiring plans, treasury interest costs, and political blame. A tax cut changes revenue, distribution, growth claims, deficit projections, and later budget fights. A spending program changes authorization language, appropriations, eligibility rules, payment channels, and oversight burdens. Democratic accountability survives only if citizens can trace which institution acted and who absorbed the cost. The unresolved judgment is hard because every answer costs something. Should economic policy prioritize democratic control, expert stability, low taxes, public investment, low inflation, or debt restraint when those goals collide? A responsible citizen cannot demand all of them without naming the trade-off. The invoice always arrives. The only question is whether the public reads it before signing. The unresolved question is whether fiscal capacity protects the public or creates a permanent contest over who pays for whose security.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.